Are you a 0 to 1 person? You hear like Peter Thiel talking about this quite a bit. Are you a 1 to 100? So are you a person that can kind of take an idea and create something out of it? Or are you a person that can take something and scale it exponentially?
Welcome to The Boost, a podcast for home service contractors. We explore leaders and innovators in home services, their personal journeys, thoughts, and experiences with growth, marketing, and succession. We cover the good, the bad, the ugly, and its ultimate impact. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Welcome to another episode of The Boost. I'm Zach Wilson, Chief Marketing Officer of Local. Today we have Dominick Blue, Founder and Chief Executive of Nostra Group. Welcome, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Just a quick background. We'd kind of met through some different groups, and I didn't even realize until today. I thought I had kind of been following you on Twitter, but I guess it must have been on Facebook, and I caught your story on, is it Will Smith? Will Smith's acquiring minds?
That's right.
Yeah, it didn't sound right saying it out loud. I'm like, different Will Smith, not Jada. Nothing to do with Jada. But yeah, you have a great story. Why don't we get into it? Let's talk a little bit about where you came from and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I was born and raised in a small town in North Carolina, grew up playing sports, baseball and football. As I approached driving age, somewhere between 13 and 16 years old, I started a lawn mowing business and the paper route. I was wholesaling candy at high school, and I was trying to figure out the concept of how do you deliver a product or service that allows you to make revenue. My entrepreneurial journey was cut short. 2008, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. 2009, I went off to boot camp and subsequently spent 11 years as a U.S. Marine. Shortly after my career in the Marine Corps, I transitioned into tech. And along that journey, I took a leap into a bunch of different business models. I founded a nonprofit, tech-enabled consulting firm. I had an investor-backed technology startup for a while. During all of this, I still had a W-2 where I was working full-time. And then last year, I launched Nostra Group with the investment thesis of going out and acquiring small family-owned businesses in the home services industries. So started out landscaping and hardscaping type businesses, and then ultimately landed on HVAC and air duct cleaning, which we can get into here in a bit.
That's interesting. I didn't know that about the hardscape when we initially talked, but I got a buddy down in Texas that was with a outdoor contracting company and then broke off. They're doing really well. I think they're Austin and Dallas. Marketing is pretty organic, pretty interesting space. So I guess let's just get into that. Why did you turn your head on landscaping and hardscaping?
Yeah, I guess funny enough, the deal went sour. I had an offer accepted. It was under LOI and we were going through due diligence. And the short story is the seller and I could not come to an agreement on what his retained salary was going to stay on with us for 12 months. And we couldn't come to an agreement on that. And ultimately, I walked away from the deal. That actually is what kind of readjusted my perspective on business models, what type of businesses to think about, and then fortuitously found the air duct cleaning business. And then that's where I ultimately developed the idea of backing into the HVAC industry. It's not that I think there's anything wrong with it. I actually think, especially here in Southern California, landscaping is something that is year round. The hardscaping itself is more of a need rather than a want, at least from my opinion. But nevertheless, I thought it was an interesting business, but that's what happened with that deal.
That's funny because I was thinking it was going to be a little bit more detailed. This big analysis and margins and market and, well, addressable market maybe, factored into all of that. But no, it sounds like it was just serendipity.
It was, yeah. And I mean, there was analysis that went into the idea of why I would go for that particular business, but it was actually my first offer I ever put out into the world. So I definitely can say the analysis that I did there versus the analysis that I did subsequently everywhere else was very different. But I guess if you wanted to talk details of that particular deal, when we were doing sensitivity analysis, one of the questions was if the hardscaping, I mean, that side of the business is more project based, how do you build up enough maintenance contracts on the landscaping side to float the business in the event that the project based side of the business does take a dip, which presumably would have happened because a lot of the projects were based on the subject matter expertise of the seller. And he had a degree in plant science And it was just his field of expertise that he spent 20 plus years in. Me coming in knowing that I was not a plant expert, I wasn't going to be able to retain a lot of those project-based customers that ultimately he had.
Yeah, that would be a tough knowledge transfer. Or not a landscape architect, though. No certifications.
There is a license, at least in the state of California. It's a construction-based license for the hardscape.
Okay.
And that was actually a part of the reasoning why he was going to stay on 12 months to help allow time for us to transfer that license over to me.
We had talked about offline the methods that you were using to basically get a pure interest and get deal flow. And you were different than a lot of people I've talked to, which were more digital based. You were using, I think you even mentioned Flippa, Search Funder, Biz Buy Sell. Did those come through those, or were those local introductions?
Interestingly enough, the gentleman that I closed deal number 2 on was the same broker that introduced me to the first deal. That's how we built a relationship together. He was the broker that was selling that business. And I guess funny enough, just to give you an idea of that particular deal, he ended up not selling that business just because of some of the requirements that the seller was demanding. But in the early days, I think all of us do this, right? We first stop is go to Biz Buy Sell. And you just start searching. And then depending on what vertical you're in, I mentioned Quiet Light. It's a lot of software as a service type businesses, cloud-based businesses, e-commerce, things of that nature. And then Flippa is another one, acquire.com. All of these are areas that folks can kind of go and see, in some cases, pre-vetted deals to some extent. There's a new one out there called mainshares.com. That actually is a platform that serves as a marketplace for searchers to be paired with investors, which I think is a really interesting concept. But what actually worked for me ultimately was not so much building deal flow from these websites, but building relationships with the brokers that I met from these websites.
Yeah, that's funny because I don't even know when I stopped, but I started down that path, constantly reading listings and searching listings on various platforms. And I think the learning there is you can, at least from me, I don't know about yourself, but you get a really good idea of what the market is. And that gives you some ideas of what's being put out there from a product standpoint or business standpoint, and then what, people are asking for. And from my standpoint, I always did just cursory analysis on, depending on what I was looking at. Is this a customer acquisition piece? Is this an employee acquisition piece? And what are they asking for said assets, right? It probably gives you some ideas once you step into it. I guess just speaking to your experience in terms of using those platforms to inform and help educate you.
I'll give you a good example. Before I found the air duct cleaning business, I actually was specifically looking for HVAC. And what I found was a lot of the businesses in my particular region that I was looking at, a lot of the deals that I was looking at had a key man issue. So in essence, the owner also acted as the office manager, the customer service rep, the lead technician, the estimator, so on and so forth. They held all these hats. And I knew, at least from the thesis that I had built, that was not what I was looking for. However, it did inform me that if I could buy a business that had a management layer, that had the infrastructure in place, at least something I could build on, then there was a ton of opportunity out there for me to do follow-on bolt-on acquisition. That one piece of information, as soon as I found the air duct cleaning business, I said, okay, now that I am informed about what's in the market for these HVAC businesses, I kind of have a game plan that I can immediately put together with this and that.
Yeah. I think that's important when you're trying to do a bolt-on business, right? Like you said in our pre-call, was the way you entered into it was obviously for a reason and pretty serendipitous, but it was also a blessing, right? If you want to talk about some of the details about the business and how you acquired them in terms of how you structured those deals and what the multiples on those deals were and what you were actually trying to buy, right? And we can start with the air quality, the duct cleaning, pure air SD, right? Why were you acquiring that? What did you want out of that business and how did you structure it?
There's a couple features to highlight when I found this deal. One was the COD model, the cash on delivery. So there was practically no accounts receivable for this business, which was really attractive. That was one feature. The second feature was, as I dug into just the day-to-day life, obviously I'm trying to evaluate the key man problem because that's what I was seeing in the HVAC industry. So as I was digging into the day-to-day life of the seller, what I realized was, I mean, this guy was traveling like 7 or 8 months out of the year. I mean, he was always somewhere else other than where the business was. The more I asked about this, the more I realized there's a small management team that's really running this thing. I mean, he has oversight, he has communication, he's overviewing like finances and things of that nature. But ultimately, the day-to-day operations are ran by this management team. And that was kind of the big selling factor for me. Those two things, and then plus the multiple. I ultimately bought it at just below a 3x multiple on STE. And we can get into that here in a second. But between the price, the management layer, and the COD model, those were the big things that told me like, hey, I should go try to do this.
When did that first close?
Yeah, so it was Q1 of 2024. I put in the offer July of 2023. We worked through all of the details. There were some hangups towards closing. Closing originally was supposed to be late November, early December of 2023. There were some issues that we ran into with tax filings on the seller side that ultimately we got resolved, and then subsequently closed with first day of operations being January 19th, 2024.
So the first engagement was literally the middle of 2023?
6 months. Yeah, almost 7 months to the day.
Not quick, not quick.
No, no.
And then we can jump into the error ASAP in a second, but I want to circle back to the deal, the multiple and the SDE, which is not something that we talk about a lot here, but SDE is seller's discretionary earnings. And it's essentially the total financial benefit of one individual owner operator would derive from that business in a single year.
That's right.
Let's just say they would make $100,000, right? And just walk the audience how this deal was structured using SDE then.
Yeah, absolutely. So the margins were anywhere between 50 and 60% gross margins. SDE was somewhere in between 6 and 650. There was a bit of fluctuations. When I averaged it out, I think it came down to somewhere near 500. But in 2023, it was actually quite high because they had the best year. They came in just at 2 million in revenue.
And they had $500,000 in SDE.
Yeah. So margins were really good. Like I said, no AR, practically no commercial work. It was mostly residential, greater than 95% residential. The deal structure itself, it was financed. It was backed by an SBA loan. On top of that, some equity injection. And I ultimately invested off my own balance sheet with a small friend and family round, but didn't take on any major institutional investors or anything like that. Yeah. So you could say, I mean, I guess if we're just talking to the listeners for a second here, like the SDE is ultimately what the owner is experiencing in post net income.
Right. It for one single year.
Yeah, for one single year. That's right.
It's a little bit different than a raw EBITDA multiple, right?
That's right.
They're calculated differently. So
yeah, they're calculated differently. That's right.
Right. I actually don't even know the answer to this. How is SDE calculated?
It's somewhere in between EBITDA and net income. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the idea of add backs. When you're looking at SDE, you're looking at add backs as well. So for instance, maybe the owner is paying for, I don't know, a family member who really isn't working in the business, or maybe owner has a car payment that is kind of lumped into the financials for the business. These are all things you could think of that are a benefit to the owner. Well, those would get added back to the bottom line, get added back to the net income. And so the reasoning behind that is I'm not going to have those same payments or salaries. So that would be dollars that are added back to the net income that I would realize as the new owner coming in. So that's kind of how that's broken down. Not that it's completely subjective, but every accountant and broker will kind of analyze this differently, because you could go to one banker and they'll have an opinion on what an add back is versus another who may be stricter and say, no, we're not counting that as an add back. You need to leave it in there. So there's a bit of fluctuation in how that's going to be calculated ultimately. But conceptually, that's what it means.
Some big ones are cars, boats, country club memberships. And like you said, the hairy example of paying your cousin Betty, who actually doesn't do anything for the business or something like that. Those are some pretty glaring, typical add backs.
That's right.
Thanks for clarifying that and walking that through. I think that's important to understand. When you were calculating the SDE, the seller's discretionary, is that like, I don't know, like a compromise, or is it just like I'm trying to pull you down or they're trying to pull themselves up?
At least in my experience, a lot of the negotiation was not done from me to the seller. It was me to the broker. And so this is one of the many reasons why I was so appreciative of this broker. He was very strict on what his ad backs were. So his numbers were pretty spot on. But in the due diligence process, when you're doing accounting due diligence or financial due diligence, depending on what you want to call it, you're really evaluating, is this considered an ad back or not? And so you would collect follow-up questions and then you would bring that back to the broker and have a discussion on, okay, is this actually an ad back? Should it be an ad back based on my accountant, based on the bank, the lender in some cases, right? The lender has a say in all of this as well, because ultimately they're looking at the deal from a risk lens and saying, is this actually the number the new owner is going to see or not? Because a lot of that's factored into the risk analysis for the debt coverage. So ultimately those questions are collected and then brought back for negotiation. And there's other deals that ultimately I didn't do where it's such a tangled mess that you can't actually tell what is the owner's personal expenses versus what is actually a business expense. And so it's so muddled that you walk away from that because a bank's not going to lend to that.
And just for clarification, we're still talking about pure air quality and duct cleaning. Did this one have any like really glaring ad backs?
No, when we were doing analysis, one of the big questions was, of course, there's concerns with every deal. One of the concerns was the quality of revenue. So the quality of revenue and the sustainability of the growth were the two big things. One, can you still, as a new owner, sustain the same type of growth that the previous owner had? And two, what is the quality of the revenue? And by that, I mean, where's that revenue coming from? What type of customers are they? Are they customers that are difficult to deal with or not difficult to deal with, whatever the case is? Some of that you can't really discern from doing due diligence. It's post-acquisition things you learn. In my case, those were the big questions, specifically related to the FTE and ad backs. There wasn't anything that was completely glaring that popped out, like you mentioned country club memberships or medical bills or house payment or anything like that. It was pretty clean.
That's good. It makes it easier.
Yeah.
If there are a lot of ad backs and some foolish ones, like you just mentioned, cars, boats, whatever, country club, as long as they're, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as long as they're discovered and they're applied correctly, it doesn't really benefit anybody, right? I mean, it kind of all comes out in the laundry, right?
That's a good question. I think the easy answer is it depends. That's the typical answer, right? It depends. And I'll give you a good example. Let's say it's a work truck and the owner drives that truck, but that truck is also actually used and it's revenue producing for the business. That's something that could be argued. One, that truck's going to stay with the business. It's actually a revenue producing truck, but I do drive it home every night. It's like, okay, well, there is some benefit to the owner for that, but it is tied to the P&L to some extent. Now, if I said I drive a Rolls Royce, that Rolls Royce is not coming with the business, but the business pays for it. That's totally different.
Right. The latter is the one I'm talking about. As long as those are surfaced, then they're pretty clear to just pull out. And
I would say quantitatively, yes. Now, qualitatively, you have to ask yourself, if you're uncovering all of these random things that are being added back, you always have to assume, what is it that I don't see? And you have to ask yourself, if I do see all of this and it is this tangled on the surface and I can discover that, then chances are there's probably worse stuff that's tangled below the surface that you can't actually see that you're going to discover later on. And I can kind of go into some of those things for me, like lessons learned from the first acquisition that I discovered. It was things that I couldn't see on some of them I could have and I missed them, but other things I couldn't see until post acquisition.
what was an example?
One I completely missed. It was my fault when I was doing the assessment. So when you acquiring a truck based business, you could think landscaping, plumbing, HVAC, like all of these are truck based businesses. There's metrics out there to measure how much revenue you're supposed to produce per truck that kind of tells you whether or not you're hitting the mark or not. You have to remember to look at the quality of the asset. I came down and inspected the business. But what I did not do, I didn't crawl under the truck and I didn't look at maintenance records and I didn't test drive the trucks and say, how good are they? And the problem that I ran into, and again, it's a punch in the face for me, it's my mistake, was I had to replace 40% of my fleet within the first 90 days.
Yeah, I've heard this before from other people where they just acquired this business and they just acquired a bunch of really crappy sets that
All
were
lemon.
not worth
Yeah.
anything. Right.
Yeah.
That's a good one for sure.
That's been a big lesson learned. The other one, which I suppose there's arguments to be made that this was a complete mistake on my fault too, because they do say in due diligence, interview the customers. That is very dependent on the seller. Yeah, that's a difficult one to ask. Like, hey, let me go talk to your customers. And I haven't had personal success with that. Does that mean I should have walked away from the deal? Maybe. But nevertheless, that was something that I did not do. And what I discovered on the other side, going back to this quality of revenue thing, how we were cultivating the appointments for these customers, there was a mismanagement in expectations for a lot of the customers that we were interacting with. So there was a lot of callbacks, there were upset customers, and we can kind of get into the business model of air duct cleaning and some of the challenges there. But they thought the company was a scam. There were weird issues where, because of how we were developing the demand generation for the business, so the lead generation and how we were capturing it, just was poor quality, and it was resulting in poor quality customers. So our ticket averages were lower, our callback were very high, upset customers, reputation damage, all these things kind of resulted out of this low quality type of customer. And the biggest delta between me and the seller was, for the seller, it was, I'm going to take a job no matter what that job is, as long as it's within the confines of this business, or I can make an argument for that because I want to make revenue. Whereas for me, having a military background, really thinking about being a community leader, really thinking about reputation and loyalty and customer trust, I went into this saying, one, we can't do business with people who are what I call bad customers. We're not going to service those people because it's not a mutually beneficial relationship. Two, we have to focus on how we're developing customer trust. That was never a concept. And in some ways, we took a hit for it in the beginning. We're picking up momentum 6 months later, but it was definitely a culture shift in the beginning that we experienced. Those were really the two big takeaways that I had from that acquisition, two big lessons learned that I'll carry going forward.
I've seen some of that in people's CRMs, which is kind of funny. They have like tags that are like bad customer or like explains a lot, or one client has a no review. They want to make sure they don't solicit people that are fickle, or they are going to give them a negative review because it didn't go swimmingly. So yeah, that's interesting.
It's funny, in the CRM that we use, there's actually a toggle button that says do not service. And I kind of use that. I call it the blacklist button. There's a concept out there of firing your customers, and I use that liberally. Nope, we're not servicing that person anymore. They called us 15 times within 2 days. They're upset about something that we didn't even touch.
The best thing you can do is try and get away from it as cleanly as possible and hope that they don't leave you bad reviews somewhere. But yeah, I mean, things happen. Moving forward into bolt-on and your ultimate desire to get into HVAC, as you said earlier, I think that I understood it correctly. Your broker was representing Air ASP and presented it to you, and you were interested, correct?
That's right. That's right. So there was kind of this little node network of individuals that ultimately led me to these two deals. So essentially, the broker that was selling the landscaping business introduced me to a banker. I built a relationship with that banker. That banker introduced me to another broker. The second broker sold Pure Air SD to me. And then, because I had a pre-existing relationship with that first broker, I reached back out to him just to catch up. And he said, oh, by the way, I have an HVAC business. I don't know if you're still in the market. He knew what my investment thesis was. And then that's how I got deal number two. He brought that to me. That's kind of how that works. But for the listeners, I want to highlight this. The relationships are everything. You have no idea what opportunities you're opening yourself up to by building relationships with these types of individuals, because you don't know where they are going out and what they're doing. As you're entering this space and you're thinking about going and acquiring your first business, second, third, whatever, really think about every single person that I talk to. I want to build a relationship, obviously more than transactional relationships here, but I want to take a chance to learn from this individual and build a relationship with this individual, because you don't know where that's going to go in the future.
And you're talking about the entire network of lawyers, brokers, bankers.
Everyone. Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Was the banker someone local, or is that Matthias? No.
No. The banker, he was a business development officer at one of the regional banks here in California.
I think I saw it on LinkedIn or something. You had thanked a bunch of people, Matthias and some other people, for helping you through the deal, but it sounded like they were indirect mentors, and I wasn't sure if you ended up working with them or not.
Yeah, I actually brought Matthias and some other folks to USC to speak on an ETA panel, entrepreneurship through acquisition panel. So that's probably where you saw that. I was thanking them for coming out and sharing their wisdom and providing insights to my fellow classmates.
Oh, gotcha. Was that undergrad or grad?
It was a Master of Business grad school.
Going back to the second deal here, the HVAC company, Air ASP, ASAP, keep doing that. Going back to that, and you entered into that deal as part of your investment thesis, which was basically all hands off deck, which I don't know if that's a phrase or not, which is basically the idea of delegation, right? You don't want to be in the trenches. You don't want to be in the weeds. Correct me if I'm wrong. You want to be the investment vehicle and the umbrella, but you don't want to be at the operating level.
That's right. I think saying I don't want to is a strong phrase, and I try to steer away from that mainly because I don't want people to get the idea that Dominic's scared of hard work. If you look on my LinkedIn, for anybody that ends up going to my LinkedIn and taking a look, there's my banner. There's like a little board on there and it says whatever it takes. And that's a mantra that I live by. In essence, it means it doesn't matter if everybody quit today. I'm not going to just lay down and roll over.
Sure.
I'll start from zero if I have to. I've been at the bottom, so it doesn't scare me to have to go back to the bottom and figure it out again, right? So coming into this, I said, Michael Girdley talks about this at length for anybody who's interested in holdcos and being a holdco CEO. Being a holdco CEO is very different than being a operating company CEO. And I think the way my mind has developed over the years, I naturally lean more toward being a holdco CEO, thinking about capital allocation, scaling people is a passion of mine. And when you're at the holdco level, you can really think about those things in depth. Whereas at an operating company level, sometimes, a lot of times you're spending your time putting out fires and thinking more tactically, right? So that's really the delta between holdco CEO and operating company CEO, whether you're thinking more strategically more of the time or more tactically more of the time. And so going into this, my thought was I can achieve what I want probably at a faster pace if I'm at the holdco level, not at the operating company level. Keep in mind, I still have a W-2, which throws people for a loop, which means my day to day is actually taken up by a full-time job. So I'm spending nights and weekends.
Still right now?
Yep.
Wait, who you work for?
I work for a CRM company that people can see more about if they go to my LinkedIn. I'm on parental leave right now.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha.
Yes, it seems like I have a lot more free time, but it's because I'm on parental leave.
I did know that, but for some reason I thought you had shed that or became full-time in the holdco, but I guess not.
No, not yet. And that's why when people ask me, like, what is Nostra Group? I say it's an investment vehicle because operationally, I have a bookkeeper. Like, I don't have a staff. I'm not holding staff meetings. It's purely an investment vehicle. Now, that may change in the future, but, for the time being, that's the current state. So, yeah. Kind of going back to what you were asking me about earlier about being hands off. I originally brought in an operator because I had my baby. I had my son shortly after acquiring business number one. So I needed somebody to kind of have eyes on the business while I was taking care of my wife and my son. Unfortunately, he didn't last, but we did have an arrangement where he was going to have substantial equity stake in the company over the life of the loan. We had a vesting schedule where he was going to end up with 40% approximately of the equity in the business.
That's crazy. I'm dying to know the epilogue to this story because I knew about this, but I didn't know that it didn't work out. This is news. So,
yeah.
Where's my popcorn?
Yeah. So, I mean,
what happened?
I got nothing but love for him. He ultimately stayed in the military. He ended up signing a new contract. He got promoted. He stayed in. I have nothing but great things to say about him. Ultimately, I think what the crux of the problem was, anybody that's ran a small business knows it's very dynamic. You're making hundreds, if not thousands of decisions day to day, every single day. And it doesn't stop. There is no pause button. Just as soon as you put one fire out, four more are popping up. And I think just the sheer amount of dynamic nature tactically was kind of paralyzing while simultaneously having to put on the CEO hat and think, okay, where are we going to be in 90 days? You can't even see 90 minutes into the future. How am I going to see 90 days or further? Then you have a guy like me who's always running 100 miles an hour over top, thinking about forecasting and capital allocation and this and that. And oh, by the way, I'm bringing on another acquisition. So now you're going to have to do a merger Now we're doing software implementation. There is too much. It's daunting. And I've said this before, and I will always say this. I think he would be a rock star GM. Absolutely, hands down, would crush it. But having to oscillate between tactical and strategic and being able to autonomously make those decisions, it just was not a good fit for him at that point in his life. So I told him I want to pull him out of the trenches. I don't want his family and him to suffer any type of issues related to mental health or anything like that. So I decided for us to go separate ways about 8 weeks into it.
So are you still looking to fill that position?
No, not now. I recalibrated the leadership strategy, and how I explained it to a friend of mine was companies our size, we're not big enough to go recruit the A players and pay them 250 grand a year. Those are the type of people where you kind of just set them and forget. You get out of their way. They're going to build the strategy. They're going to execute on it. They're going to develop their team. They're going to do everything, right? They're a one-stop shop. We're not big enough to do that. Not yet.
I think a big important piece of that too is not only are you not big enough from probably personnel size, revenue, et cetera, but you're also at the point which you alluded to earlier. It's super messy, right? More than likely not a problem that someone is going to want to solve. They want things a little bit more dialed up, a little bit more process, some dotting of I's and crossing of T's to already be done. They'll come in and, finish the paragraph and write the rest of the story. But if your basic, grammar and sentence structure is off, it's like,
Right.
This is a lot to deal with.
Two things. Like the first one is in tech, at least, we talk a lot about, are you a 0 to 1 person? You hear like Peter Thiel talking about this quite a bit. Are you a 0 to 1? Are you a 1 to 100? So are you a person that can kind of take an idea and create something out of it? Or are you a person that can take something and scale it exponentially? And what I realize is to bring in an executive like that, they're typically, the way their mind is wired and how they're cultivated as leaders over their careers, they're a 1 to 100 person. We're still kind of in that 0 to 1 phase where your exit velocity, you start to hit that around 5 million in revenue, right? Where you got some infrastructure, you can support meaningful salaries and start to attract that top talent. But right now we're not there yet. We're still small, scrappy. The processes haven't been defined, right? Taking that into consideration, told my GM, I said, listen, we're going to strap on our running shoes. And I think we'll have some managers in place. We're bringing on a new office manager to help define some of our internal processes. And then we're bringing on an HVAC manager to help lead some of the HVAC operations. But I think between the three of them, we can get to the next level where we can start thinking about, okay, what does that next executive leadership role look like?
In light of that, I don't know how we're doing our chronological ordering, but let's just say that's step B. Is C to get that all situated? What comes after that? Is it build those up and try and get some economies of scale and growth there? Or is it do it bolt on another ancillary service, complementary service, another business? What is the Nostra Group master plan?
Yeah, great question. Great question. The way I'm structuring Nostra Group, the example I use all the time is the Virgin Group. Everybody knows who Richard Branson is. Everybody knows Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Mobile, Virgin Records. If you look at their business model, it's actually built on a model called the Karatsu business model. It was created and innovated on by the Japanese business leaders of post-World War II, Japan. They kind of centralize around a bank and they support each other in mutually beneficial ways. So when you look at Virgin Group, everything is centered around the Virgin Group, which is kind of their management company. And then all of proceeds go to Virgin Group, and then capital is reallocated in a strategic fashion to grow any one of their particular business processes. Nostra Group is built in that exact same way. So the first step for us, because we're not walking in with 9 figures of investment to do this, the first step is to build an economic engine that gives us the capital to then start thinking about either raising a fund or going out and doing more investments. So we're using that to build spinoffs. So we're doing spinoffs, plus we're going to do bolt-on acquisitions for this one particular company so that we can grow it to a meaningful size, at which point we're building as if we're going to exit. That's the plan. So you build as if you're going to exit, and you can decide whether or not you choose to exit depending on macro market conditions. But yeah, so we're doing that, growing organically and through acquisition for company one. doing spin-offs for company 2, 3, 4, and then launching some other interesting projects over the next few years for additional business projects that will be under the Nostra Group umbrella. So it's a combination of all those things.
From a investment strategy thesis, are you geographically aligned? Are you vertically aligned? What's the overarching vision for holdings within Nostra Group?
I think there is a defined theme. They kind of rely, I should say, they sit inside of what's called a MEP, which stands for mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. So thinking in terms of engineering and contracting. So HVAC is a contracting firm, right? Plumbing is a contracting firm. You hold a contractor's license and you do technical work, so services and installs. But engineering is more on the design side of the house, design, construction management, things like that. There's a thesis that is being built in my mind where we do both the contracting and the engineering. And then we're looking at some really interesting industries, kind of pulling from my background in technology. There's some really interesting industries that we're thinking about going into in the future. But that's kind of the theme. If you look at my background, I mean, it's so diverse. I have a lot of interests. And I think as long as I can tie those together to figure out one of the first principles of anything we do is how do I connect it to something else that we're already doing? If I can't make that connection in my head, then we don't do it. To give you an idea, if I wanted to go create a tech startup, well, I'm not going to go start an e-commerce business or some type of software as a service business that has no relation to what I'm doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So probably safe to say that it's going to be in home services
Maybe.
based on where we're starting.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though, because we're in home services today, but the HVAC side of our business is almost 60-40 in residential to commercial. Commercial's quickly catching up. So that's not a far leap for us. And then from commercial, you go to industrial. So, not to say that we'll go touch industrial, but I think there's an argument that could be made. There is a path that could be created to go do that.
I've found the industrial or mechanical, it's so aptly named in this industry side of the business, is some pretty crazy stuff. To me, residential and even commercial HVAC is pretty vanilla, pretty basic. You get up to mid and high rise buildings, and between the mechanicals, all the engineering issues that you have to deal with, and all of the building automation now and the technology that sits behind that stuff, it is some complicated stuff. In January, I talked to a guy and he was with a mechanical group in Long Island, and they were dealing with, this is a wild problem. So there was like the water cooling tower things in like New York that you see at the top of every fifth building. There was some regulation that was put in by the local government, something like that. Long story short, it kind of backfired. And what happened was a very high number of those towers were starting to develop like moisture and mold problems. They were trying to fix some other air quality issue that I don't remember by implementing this regulation, and went too far and created a moisture buildup in all of these little like cooling water tower things. They were now coming in basically wave 2 or 3 of this regulation that was like they were having to put these massive infrared controls into these cooling towers to make sure that it was decontaminating all of the air. I think they were mostly mid-rises. The new modern high-rises don't have these things. It's the old mid-rises in New York City that have them. It ended up becoming like a waterfall of a business unit for them because they were the only ones that had a line on the infrared equipment from whoever the distributor, whoever it was, Johnson Controls or someone. And they were the ones that knew how to implement it and so on and so forth. But I was just like, oh my God, what a nightmare. Good for them. They're the ones that figured out how to solve this problem, but what a nightmare to deal with. And the scale that you're affecting people, like a residential, it's like you're going to affect one family, right? Like you're doing a mid-rise or a high-rise or something like that. You've got hundreds, if not thousands of people that all this stuff depends on. It's like,
Yeah.
I can see the interest in that from a scale and utility problem. There's actually another, I'm blanking on the name. They've not been on this podcast. They were actually connecting to what you talked about with Will, where you were speaking to who you were hiring for your GM role and who you were finding to give equity or provide an equity bonus structure, which was, just to brief everybody, your basic thesis was that you were looking for someone more like yourself and not someone with an Ivy League pedigree or, this world of connections. And it wasn't just, I want this person versus this person, but it was also like the person like myself who had grown up, maybe they were in the armed services or something versus, they had the pedigree, they had the connections, etc. But long story short, you're looking for those people that are going to be like scrappy and salt of the earth, roll up their sleeves and really working hard to do that versus the Ivy League grad who has probably a big Rolodex already from their upbringing. Maybe they went to HBS or something like that, or worked at McKinsey, like you said. So their network is flush, right? So it's probably not going to be a good fit. There was a group, I don't know how much you know about this, but Legacy Service Partners, they're a private equity platform, and they are requiring residential HVAC. And they got really big. And a couple of those guys, I don't know the actual story behind the why. I think they had reached the point of their interest in doing residential that they forked out and they're moving into the commercial. I can get you the name of this group if you're interested. It's escaping me right now. But really interesting part about it was their thesis. They're building a platform, national platform of commercial mechanical groups. So they were looking at air quality, electrical, they were acquiring, and HVAC, building automation, acquiring all these small, medium contractor groups. The thesis is that if you acquire enough of these, a single market, and then build upon that nationally, that they will be able to create this massive scale of contractors that will cross-sell and cross-reference within their network because they're all within the same umbrella. But the bigger thesis is that they can go up to the institutions, the BlackRocks, et cetera, that own massive portfolios of major commercial real estate and big commercial buildings and start to sell these big service contractors that actually have scale and aren't geographically limited to them. And I was like, wow, that's genius. I was blown away. I was like, wow, that's a massive, massive undertaking. That's big time.
I think there's something to be said about the de-risking when you start to diversify by region. It's something that's built into the ideas of what I'm actioning on. When you start to say, like, I'll give you an example, how summer affects residents across the country is vastly different from one coast to another. You may see a spike in revenue in Tennessee because of a heat wave, but you may not necessarily see that in California, but you might see more sustainable cash flows from California on a per month basis because it doesn't really fluctuate all that much. There's some really interesting dynamics when you start talking about diversification of region.
For sure. Of course, you have to be able to create those economies of scale and
Absolutely
fold them all under and create this nice synergistic business. But yeah, once that's all done, it's great. Super easy.
Yeah. Once you get past the mountain, the valley's great.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Where are you at right now in terms of where you've come since January? You've got, 2 businesses now folded under Nostra Group. Are they doing well? Are you meeting your goals? Top line revenue? Are you growing? You're about to finish a rebrand, so that's a big milestone.
We are, yeah. I guess this is another key takeaway for the listeners. Don't grow too quickly. We actually ran into a cash flow issue because a mistake that I overlooked in my planning was how fast do you grow with your commercial practice because of the net 30, right?
Oh, yeah. Versus COD. Right.
Right. We were growing exponentially. If you just look on an accrual basis, we grew 40% in revenue from February to June.
But cash was not.
But yeah, so now we're playing catch up, right? Because we're 30 days behind that cash. Thankfully, I didn't cross a Rubicon. I didn't burn the boats. There was at one point where I said, we're going to reallocate all resources to HVAC so that we can sustain the growth that we were experiencing. And I have since reversed course and we've rebalanced the teams so that we have the appropriate resources allocated for air duct cleaning and the appropriate resources for residential and commercial. And I have put a pause on the growth on the commercial side because two things, both from an asset resource perspective, we were constrained, but even more importantly, we were from a skills capability perspective, we were hindered quite significantly because finding talented service technicians that can run their own truck, their own crew is actually quite difficult.
One of the reasons for acquiring Air ASP was resources, right? That was the play.
Yeah. Yes, but it came with its own set of customers, its own set of revenue, its own geographic territory that they were servicing. So those technicians are still servicing that area. So when you pivot business models, and again, this is just what I experienced, you got to remember in San Diego, we were just an air duct cleaning company. In Orange County, we were an HVAC company. But when I made the merger, now everything was an HVAC company.
And not geographically aligned either.
Exactly. So we got economies of scale in our marketing, but that actually created an issue because we were getting too many jobs in San Diego, but we didn't have the technicians in San Diego that could go service those jobs. They were all up north.
Yeah.
That's what we ran into. We had technicians driving all over the place. I mean, killing time, right? We had to dial it back until we got the resources in place. To your question, that's what we're focused on right now is doing some hiring. We have some folks that are starting in the next week or two that are going to add 2 and 3 trucks to the region here down in San Diego that allow us to continue some of that growth. So for me coming into this, my big focus was growth through acquisition, but I took that same mentality of let's run fast at this problem and applied it to the organic growth. And I poured too much fuel on the fire, and then the fire got too big and we couldn't control the fire. So we had to figure out how to, dial it down a little bit.
Yeah.
So we didn't get our heads too far out over our skis.
Right. Well, that's smart. We see that on the marketing side. I want to grow. I want to grow. I want to grow. Maybe appreciate this the chicken and the egg, right? Like, well, I can't grow without leads. It's very hard to turn on marketing. And if you don't have certain systems in place and have it actually work for you, because it's more like a spigot than it is a water fountain or something, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It opens up or it doesn't. And it's hard to dial it back. And it's killer because you end up paying a lot more for your marketing qualified leads. Why do you pay more for them? Because you can't book them, you can't service them. Basically, a distressed company. You're understaffed and your utilization is probably too high or it's just not organized well or something. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier with your buddy that came on as GM and left. They're hard problems to solve because you got stuff coming at you in all directions. What am I going to fix this week? What am I going to perfect? That's basically how you have to look at it.
And I think that what makes it hard for some people is there is no right answer, right? There is no, I can go look this up in a book and get a binary yes or no. This is the right answer I should do.
Right.
Because it changes from day to day. What works today may not work next week when we have a heat wave. It's going to change everything. What works next week may not work post election time. That may change things. So it's just the sheer dynamic nature of all this. This is the exact question that I wrangle with every day. How do you balance marketing with service capability? Capacity, right? Capacity. In essence, it's capacity planning. But, which one do you turn on first? Do you turn the marketing on first or do you hire a bunch of people? There's no easy way around it. It's really a balancing act. For me, coming into this, I spent so much time thinking about the growth through acquisition that admittedly I didn't spend enough time thinking about problems like this where it's like, okay, how do you balance hiring one person, maxing them on capability, hiring another person? How do you balance that with how much you're investing in marketing, all those things? So
you've definitely got a fun one ahead of you, given you're in 2 markets. How much space in between?
I'd say probably an hour and 15 minutes.
They can overlap in the middle. I mean, if you've got a 35-minute trip time, there's some overlap. Oh, that's a good local SEO, Google business profile maps problem. It's always a challenge to dominate space that's distally far from your primary office location. The fact that you're getting aligned and all that's definitely going to help. That's likely a play that having multiple business locations makes sense if you're that far. How many miles is that in SoCal terms? 60 or like 20?
Probably like 50.
50.
50.
Yeah, because once you get north of San Diego and south of Orange County, you get some space where you can move at a good clip. It's once you get approximately close to those population densities where you're like mile per minute drops down dramatically, right? You can actually go a mile a minute in between there, but then once you get in, you're going more a mile every 5 minutes, something like that.
But thankfully for us, the way the 2 sites are located, we're off of both the 5 and the 15, which are the 2 main highways that run north and south. So we're 10 minutes. Our headquarters is 10 minutes from either highway. And our Orange County site is 3 minutes from the highway. So it's like going north and south isn't actually that big of a problem because we're on the highway. Where that stretch of highway is, there is construction, but like from a mile per minute standpoint, it's actually not too bad. It's nothing like once you get closer to LA or something like that, where it's very dense. For the most part, as long as the trucks are operating in their own regions, we don't have that much of an issue.
That's good. That's good. Well, cool. Just in terms of closing this out, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your time. Congratulations on the newish boy to you and your wife. In terms of connecting with you, your LinkedIn, X, and Facebook, do you have a preferred? Where do you spend most of your time?
I spend most of my time on LinkedIn. If I had to stack rank them, LinkedIn, then X, and then Facebook. I'm rarely on Facebook, but LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on there. Folks want to reach out, just Dominick Blue. There's not a whole lot of Dominick Blues that live in San Diego. I'm the only ones. And then X, same thing. Dominick Blue is the handle there.
And then nostragroup.com. We'll put this all in the show notes too. That's great. That's awesome. And I encourage you to follow Dominic, especially once the rebrand releases. We'll look forward to seeing that. I know you're using KickCharge, so that will be fun. Well, awesome. Thank you. And for everybody listening, please subscribe on your favorite channel and go out and get them. Thanks, everyone.